Have individuals like the commenter who will say, oh, Hannibal was African, he was very clearly black, but in reality that probably wasn't the case.
Makeup of the Phoenician colonists at the time.
Hannibal was a Carthaginian and of Phoenician aristocratic stock, Phoenicia being historically here around Lebanon, North Africa. Recreations using Phoenician DNA has come up with results like this.
Let me stop you there. Which Phoenician DNA, which colony, and which period? Because as we clearly saw in episode 34, Phoenicia was clearly black until very late. I encourage you to watch that video as we cover a lot of evidence showing the ethnicity of the true originators of Phoenicia. But today, we will see the life of Hannibal, his victories, how he outsmarted Rome. Really, the greatest military mind of all time. We will also cover the evidence clearly showing the ethnicity of the Carthaginians and the evidence that shows, without the shadow of a doubt, that Hannibal was indeed a black African.
Hannibal Barca was black. And you see arguments about the Phoenician lineages, and people are going to bring up Berbers, but it's this, I've noticed this attempt to differentiate North Africa from the rest of it. It's attempting to erase the black history of North Africa away, as if like they were never up there to begin with.
Virtually all depictions of Hannibal Barca that you can find online and in traditional media paint him as a European. But historical evidence clearly shows that not only Hannibal was black, but Carthage was a black African civilization. And just like ancient Egypt Kemet, there has been a deliberate attempt to take this great civilization out of Africa and claim it as European. In order to do so, you will hear the term Mediterranean thrown around as if it was a justification of its antecedent in 300 BC. From its people to its elite and its star generals, we will review how we can definitively speak to the ethnicity of the Carthaginians before the Roman invasion. We will also see how great and how influential this civilization was for the modernization of man. This is the Without History channel. Every episode, we bring salient facts about African ancient civilizations and history, and detail how these civilizations contributed to our modern world. We dive deep into what research has to say about the often overlooked or misattributed contributions of these key eras in our collective history. In this episode, we will be looking at a man who stood, who still stands, as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, military minds in history. A man who carried the whole future of a nation on his shoulder. A young man who grew up in the northern African coast, facing southern Europe, where his ambitions lied. And his name is Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian. One of these men who, through their incredible deeds, have immortalized his name and that of his kingdom. Legend has it that when Hannibal was a young man, his father, the general Hannibal Barca, made him swear a life oath to never pay allegiance to the Romans. Perhaps an indication of their major cultural differences. Differences that are not only marked by the Mediterranean Sea that separated them, but also by their respective origins. And it is the eternal and surreal story of this African military genius that history has left us as lesson, a true passing of the civilization torch. From his early life, the beauty of his hometown, to his military victories, and his ultimate demise, we will see how Hannibal brought the mighty Rome to the brink. This ancient proverb sums up well the life of Hannibal, son of the great general Hamilcar Barca, a great military general in his own right, who taught his sons everything he knew. The master guides the way, but the student walks it. But Hannibal had a saying of his own when he encountered difficulties. If I cannot find a way, I will make one. But who was Hannibal? And who were the Carthaginians? How did this African kingdom come to dominate the Mediterranean with its star general? The one that many agreed is the greatest military mind in history. I am a strong subscriber to the value for value model. If you feel that this channel has brought you and your loved ones some value, I would be immensely grateful if you would consider returning that value in any way you can, either in the form of subscriptions to the channel or Patreon, or through sharing it with others so we can get the word out. A special thanks to these supporters who have taken up the call to arms and are contributing to the spreading of real history. If you are looking for Hannibal's battles, please use the YouTube chapter guide, or look for the chapter bookmarks in the description. Carthage, the city of wealth. Diodorus of Siculus, the ancient Greek historian, gave the following account of the Carthaginian countryside. All the land was set with gardens and arches, watered by numerous springs and canals. There were well-constructed country houses, built with lime, announcing widespread wealth. Each house was an elongated rectangle, with a back and front entrance opening onto the streets. A side corridor ran uninterrupted through each building, connecting both entranceways. Depressions have been found in these corridors, indicating the location for eliminating household waste into stone-lined soakways built in the streets. Some of the buildings were dual-purpose, with shops on one of the street fronts. All the houses were built around a central courtyard, which formed its primary light source. The courtyard was also the site of the household's water cistern. One house with a partitioned courtyard had several small rooms built directly onto it. Some seemed to be for storage purposes, but one was a bathroom, complete with water and waste pipes and a terracotta mosaic floor. A city of such opulence and wealth needed to be protected from the insecurity that plagued the classical empires. Pirates and small-armed groups would prey on exposed, undefended countrysides, but not Carthage. The Africans erected a 3-layer defensive wall all around the city. The wall was equipped with watchtowers and archer stations on its inner layer. In between the second and third wall, the Carthaginians had garrisoned troops, all of it, culminating in a fantastic defensive posture that stood for 6 centuries. But as the admitted naval power of the ancient world, it is its ports that marked a notable difference with its contemporaries. The main trading port could house up to dozens of ships. These would have been loaded and unloaded by professional dock workers. The military port was built rather late in Carthage history, especially after having lost their fleet more than once due to ship-burning techniques or ship-hauling heists used by the Romans. The port was circular in nature and could house the majority of Carthage's fleet. One of its most impressive features is that the central part of the dock was a man-made island with an observation tower. It was also said to have a gigantic chain-link gate, a true innovation for its time. It would have been in one of those luxurious districts that the upper class of Carthage, mostly merchants, would have had their country houses. Afar from the busy and sweltering streets of downtown Carthage, with its constant noisy street sellers and the not-so-distant sound of the ships. As the second agricultural hub of the ancient world, this African empire in its apogee was the feared power of the Mediterranean. Typical wealthy Carthaginian houses had a winery and a baking oven, and rich houses even had bathrooms. In addition, each one of these houses had a cistern. Unlike the Romans, the Carthaginians did not have aqueducts, but used this water retention system instead. The cisterns were exceedingly deep and covered with a watertight lid. During the winter rains, these cisterns would get filled, enabling the Carthaginians to replenish the water supply. This also meant that during the sieges of the city, inhabitants could go very long periods without external water supply. It is probably in one of these beautiful houses that this high priestess of Carthage, the wealthy merchant class, and senators would have lived. But it is also in one of these houses that the young Hannibal would have grown up, probably fed on a diet of wheat, seafood, and olive oil, all of these found in abundance in the capital of the Old World. According to the Roman historian Livy of the 1st century of our era, Hannibal was fearless, utterly prudent in danger, indefatigable, able to endure heat and cold, controlled in eating habits, unpretentious in dress, willing to sleep wrapped in military cloak, a superb rider and horseman. He was the son of the Carthage general Hamilcar Barca. There is no knowledge of his mother in the history records, not even her name. Hannibal comes from the Barca family, a family entrenched in military tradition, and it was during the First Punic War that the young Hannibal had learned the ins and outs of war from his father, Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar Barca, father to Hannibal, was born around 275 BCE into a leading Carthaginian family, likely belonging to the influential Barcid clan. The name Barca means lightning in the Punic language, and just like his name implies, Hamilcar was quick-witted and hasty in action. Hamilcar first took command of the Carthaginian army in 247 BC in Sicily, where he rose to prominence. His expertise in guerrilla warfare had proved effective. Having lost the First Punic War and needing to pay an astronomical tribute to Rome, Carthage had to find a new source of wealth to appease the Romans. Hamilcar had led a new campaign in modern-day Spain and established a new base for Carthage there. The Iberian Peninsula was known for its wealth in minerals, particularly silver, lead, and tin. The silver mines, especially around places like present-day Cartagena, ancient Carthago Nova, would have been a vital economic asset for Carthage, helping it to pay off war indemnities and finance its military and state infrastructure. Not the least, Carthage needed a strategic foothold into Europe if it was to counter the growing influence of Rome, and Spain provided both. It was during one of those campaigns in Spain that Hannibal first displayed his military genius. With his 45,000 men and 40 elephants, accompanied by his trusted general Hanno, Hannibal was making his way to the Po Valley, where he had been informed that the Gauls were eager to support him in his campaign against Rome. At the river Rhone, where Hannibal had encamped his troops. But his path was soon blocked by the Caveres tribe that had set camp on the opposite side of the river, a Roman ally. At night, he ordered his general Hanno along with a detachment to march 40 kilometers north, about 25 miles, and cross the river. After having crossed the Rhone and rested his men, Hanno used smoke to signal Hannibal of his readiness. The trap was set. Hannibal crossed with the first wave and engaged the unfriendly Gauls that had entrenched themselves along the river in a defensive position. As the second wave of Carthaginians made their way across the river, Hanno moved to engage the northern wing of the battle. The enemy was caught completely off guard and set out to retreat, only to find that their camp had been razed by a small detachment of Hanno's troop. With this latest victory, only two things stood between Hannibal and Rome: Scipio, the father to Scipio Africanus, and those mountains which on the horizon looked like demons, wearing hats of ice and hiding the heart of the savages, the Alps. Hannibal, throughout his formative years at the side of his father, Hamilcar Barca, had learned how to use the elements, the environment, and even those who look like enemies to turn the tide of a battle. Throughout his own saga, Hamilcar was always with his two sons, Hasdrubal and Hannibal, and it is with their father that the young Africans learned all that would make Hannibal great. Although history has exposed the deeds of Hannibal Barca in such a way that they have overshadowed the accomplishments of his father, Hamilcar Barca was a true military genius in his own right. His expertise during the First Punic War stemmed from his acute utilization of guerrilla warfare and tactical acuity that saw him win multiple lopsided battles. And Hamilcar did this by utilizing the then unconventional methods of hit and run, deceptive and fluid battle formations, and simulation of army disorganization. In many ways, Hannibal Barca had an upbringing all too similar to that of Alexander the Great, where the young aristocrat would have learned many sciences, including philosophy, mathematics, history, and the art of war. But the most striking similarity with the Greek general of centuries prior was that they were both forged in the fire on the battlefield by their respective fathers who brought them along during their war campaigns. This upbringing resulted in a mind that became battle-hardened well before puberty had hit. But in the same token, because of their formal education, it also blessed them with a mind that understood well the necessities of politics in a war which required constant resources. And Hannibal was very astute in his ability to navigate the Carthaginian Senate and War Council. The mainstream elite from Carthage differed drastically from the Barcid family. Mostly merchants and traders, most would not be concerned with the preoccupations of war. What was on their mind, though, was acquisition of property and increasing their trade. Wealthy families would own more than one trading ship. Out of necessity, they would often hire mercenaries for protection during their long trips to Britain, Western Africa, Greece, and Tyre and Egypt. These mercenaries also helped establish new footholds of trade that the Carthaginians were adept at transforming into colonies as soon as critical mass enabled it. We have seen how the majority of prehistory North Africa was black, or of ethnic groups indistinguishable from what we would call black Africans today. You can check our episode on Uan Mahujaj, the infant mummy in the Libyan desert. This is corroborated by the studies done by scholars who dug up remains from ancient Carthage. Their results showed that the elite were almost exclusively black, like the remains of this high priestess of Tani. Professor Eugene Pittard had this to say about the discovery, quote, "The woman buried there had Negro features. She belonged to the African race." End quote. This is also further corroborated by Professor Stefan Sell, who stated, and I quote, "the so-called Semitic type, characterized by the long, perfectly oval face, the thin aquiline nose, and the lengthened cranium, enlarged over the nape of the neck, has not yet been found in Carthage." End quote. Carthage had been settled by Phoenicians as a city-state in North Africa near the current Tunis. In his 1961 work, French historian Gabriel Audizio comments that he considered Hannibal to be a North African. The majority of the Punic populace seems to have had African, indeed Negroid ancestry. Whether described as Carthaginians, Phoenicians, or Punics of North Africa, according to Audizio's research, they were certainly a mix of ancient Nubian stock, Aboriginal North Africans. So then, one might ask, why is it that the Carthaginian illustration that we see online always depict white people and not even Asiatics, let alone black Africans, as the research shows that they were? Well, it is important to take into context the following facts. The majority of those depictions were made centuries after Carthage had ended as a civilization. Furthermore, those who did these illustrations were themselves European. It is only natural that they would paint this most successful of generals to their image. Lastly, those depictions of Hannibal that clearly show him as phenotypically black African are seldom, if ever, shared in history documentaries and books. And yet, When you look at the coins of Hannibal minted in Italy, this is what you see. When the Roman finally defeated the Carthaginians, they engaged in the most brutal and systematic eradication of a civilization that we may have ever witnessed in history. They made all effort to erase Carthage from the map and from history. The city, its people, its culture, its relics, they were all killed, burned, and reduced to rubble and sand. This may have contributed to the animosity that the Romans started to have towards the Africans, animosity that they also had towards the Germanic tribes due to their fierce resistance to Roman rule. From the Egyptians to the Phoenicians. That the inhabitants of Carthage were majority black African is not surprising given that Carthage is an early colony of the Phoenician Empire, and the Phoenicians are a civilization that descended from the Nubio-Kemetic colonies established there throughout Kemetic rule. This can also be seen in the heritage such as the Phoenician alphabet, which Carthage also used. This alphabet, that ultimately became the basis of our modern-day alphabet, is a simplified version of the ancient Egyptian alphabet, Medu Necher. We call it hieroglyphics today. More precisely, it is from hieratic, the lesser-known but more widely used version of the Egyptian writing system, that the Phoenician alphabet comes from. On this chart, you can see how the letter F, for example, evolved from a garden snake in Medu Necher hieroglyphics to its hieratic form, which is pretty much identical to the Phoenician version. These then further evolved into their Hellenic and Roman version that we are familiar with today. And the same goes for our number system, the Arabic numerals, which derive from the Phoenicians' numeral, a direct inheritance from the Nubio-Kemetic civilization base 10 number system. So from the Africans in Kemet to the great seafarers of the ancient world, the Phoenicians established multiple colonies, and their most prominent, which came to dominate the whole Mediterranean itself, Carthage. And it is from their parent civilization that the Carthaginians got their navigation, cartography, glassmaking, metalworks, and expertise in trade networks. It is all this that helped Carthage become one of the major population centers in the 3rd century BC, with an estimated population of 500,000, a population that was fast growing, and an empire that was fast expanding, expansion which inevitably had to run into another such empire, Rome. Hannibal was all too aware of the stakes as he sent his scouting parties to determine how far Scipio's armies had reached, and this to ensure that he could make to the mountains before Scipio, hot on his heels, with a much larger force, wouldn't reach him before the time of his choosing. Carthage, the origin story. It wasn't unusual for large cities in the ancient world to have elaborate foundation myths, and Greek and Roman writers relate to us the tale of the founding of Carthage, one set more than 2,800 years ago. According to legend, Carthage was founded by Elissa, sometimes referred to as Dido, a queen of the Phoenician city of Tyre, located in modern-day Lebanon. When her father died, she and her brother Pygmalion both ascended the throne. This did not work out well, with Pygmalion eventually ordering the execution of Elissa's husband, the priest Akerbas. Elissa, along with a small group of settlers, would leave the city, sailing nearly 1,400 miles, 2,300 kilometers, west. The local king, a man named Irbas, said they could build as large a settlement as could be encompassed by an ox hide. Elissa and her settlers fashioned such a long thread with the ox hide that it carved out a substantial portion of land. Impressed and now envious, Irbas would eventually demand that Elissa marry him. The princess's response was final. She responded by killing herself with a sword atop a funeral pyre. Before she parted, she named her new town Carthage, today pronounced Carthage. It means new city in the Punic language. As soon as Carthage gained its independence from Tyre, It refashioned itself into an oligarchic republic. This was an extremely sophisticated system of government for its time. The Carthaginian government, formerly a monarchy, was a republic based on meritocracy, rule of the elite, by the 4th century BCE. The top position was held by 2 annually elected magistrates known as suffetes, judges, who governed in conjunction with a senate of between 200–300 members who held the position for life. Laws were passed by an assembly of citizens who would vote on measures proposed by the suffetes and senate. The aristocrats lived in palaces, the less affluent in modest but attractive homes, and the lower classes in apartments or huts outside the city. Lastly, there was also a council made of 104 members which decided on military matters, truly well ahead of its time. The differences between Carthage and Rome extended also to how they governed their colonies. Rome required total subjugation of a conquered land, whereas Carthage required 3 main items. Number 1, tributary duties such as taxes. Number 2, diplomatic concessions, such as realignment with Carthage's local and foreign policies. And number 3, military contributions in the form of troops and war alliances. This system served Carthage well as it grew exponentially between 800 and 300 BC. However, the same system became a liability once it was challenged by the growing might of Rome. Carthage's government, unlike the Romans, which was made exclusively of ex-military, the governing elite in Carthage was made of a merchant's class. In fact, the majority of the citizenship in Carthage was shielded from the business of war. War was a dirty business that happened on the other side of the Mediterranean, and this is why their army was patched together with a group of paid-for mercenaries with a core contingent from Carthage itself. The troops, and where they were from, most recruits, were neighboring Libyans, Numidians, but also Gauls, and sometimes Greek mercenaries. The Numidians hailed from Berber tribes in Africa. They primarily formed the brunt of the cavalry of Hannibal when they worked for him. Historian Livy describes them as by far the best horsemen in Africa. With their saddleless horses that are smaller in stature, their agility could rarely be matched. And when faced with other more armored cavalry, they excelled at picking them apart with hit-and-run techniques. As for the Libyans, who fought as light infantry, they were African mercenaries from the west of Carthage. It is reported that Carthage has such an industry that they could produce up to 200 ships within the matter of 1 month. This would prove very useful in the upcoming world against Rome. In fact, when the Romans were lucky enough to retrieve a Carthaginian ship that had run aground, they quickly realized that the Carthaginians had shipbuilding techniques that involved labeling of each part, which implied that different sections of the ship were manufactured by specialists and then brought together and assembled using a template. A true precursor to modern engineering of the industrial age. It is this industry that was supporting Hannibal in his efforts against Rome as he was making his way across the Alps. The crossing of the Alps. In order to defeat Rome, Hannibal knew that it had to strike at the heart of its power. Attacking Rome from the traditional southern route would require too large an army. There were also too many well-defended towns between the southern ports and Rome. So Hannibal did what Hannibal does best. He forged a way where none existed. He was going to cross the Alps with his whole army, and in so doing, land right in northern Italy, where the Romans expected it the least. Hannibal is said to have given this speech to the army of men who had survived and crossed the swift-flowing Rhone River. "Why are you afraid? The greater part of our journey is accomplished. Does anyone imagine the Alps to be anything but what they are? Lofty mountains. No part of the earth reaches the sky or is insurmountable to mankind. If they are passable by a few men, they are passable to armies." Hannibal lost half of his army in the first 2 weeks into the Alps. Landslides were followed by mountain tribes. Men died during hand battle with tribesmen. Starvation and disease were also companions of the embattled lot. Polybus, a Greek historian and contemporary to Hannibal, described Hannibal's arrival to the Po Valley with about 26,000 men. With his army tired from the winter crossing of the Alps, Having confronted hostile tribes, depleted from the cold, disease, and malnutrition, Hannibal finally makes it to the Valley of Po. He's aware of his weakness in such a time, and quickly moves to secure alliances with neighboring tribes who, as has been predicted, are very eager to join his ranks against the oppressive Rome. Battle of Ticinus, 218 BC. Having faced the challenges of the Alps, and having lost half of his men, Hannibal worked quickly to replenish his troops and his supplies. The Gallic tribes are indeed sympathetic to his cause, but few are willing to give men and resources for a cause that looks lost. Crossing the Alps and catching the Romans by surprise is one thing, but defeating a full Roman consular army, let alone two, that have in their ranks veteran infantry and cavalry, is for them wishful thinking at best. The Gauls do not want to give Rome further excuses to battle and lose more territory, but Hannibal labors on in his diplomatic efforts, forging alliances with some and convincing others with gold. Soon, he has enough provisions to last him a few more weeks and a few more Gaul-foot soldiers to draw a meager infantry line. With his 17-year-old son at his side, also named Scipio, later to be called Scipio Africanus, the Roman general was eager to take on Hannibal before his recruiting efforts in the Po Valley mustered too great an army. Even though these new recruits from Hannibal did not have the training nor the battle experience to face a Roman legion. He doesn't wait for reinforcement from Sicily that Rome has ordered to come to his aid, still a month away, and marches forth towards the Africans. Hannibal's scouts alert him that Scipio is only a few days' march ahead and closing in on him. The African general realizes that if he is to gain the support of the still unconvinced Gallic chiefs in the valley, he needs an early victory against Rome, and if he is to fight the more experienced Roman force, he needs to do it on his own terms. Hannibal reaches Scipio's army at their encampment in Ticinium, but the Roman general is ready to deal with this Carthaginian menace. Scipio arranges his troops with his velites up front. These troops are adept at pinning down cavalry and picking apart riders with their long spears. They also carry javelins, which when in range are lethal to mounted troops. Immediately following the velites, Scipio arranged his Roman cavalry. The intent is to shock the softened enemy with a second wave composed of experienced cavalry, once the velites have pinned down the Africans and disrupted their morale with their spears and lances. Hannibal arranges his Iberian cavalry in the front and hides his prized Numidian cavalry in two groups behind the front line. To the Roman general, Hannibal's force would have looked like a regular flat army formation. It was anything but. A keen observer, Hannibal assesses that Scipio's cavalry is fewer in number and not intending to join the battle yet. This was because the Roman cavalry was waiting for the velites to do their part and create disruption in Hannibal's troop, probably intending to pour onto the African general's line in a wedged cavalry formation. The young Hannibal did not intend to find out. He orders his cavalry to forego the usual orderly march towards the enemy, which were methodical but slow, and instead to charge full speed towards the enemy without regard for the velita spears. This would have qualified as pure madness in normal circumstances, but in this instance, the sheer mass of the full cavalry, charging full stallion speed towards the velites on foot, brought sudden dread to the Roman front line. Scipio reacted by quickly switching his lines and moving his cavalry to meet Hannibal's and protect his foot soldiers from this tsunami of horses. The velites didn't even have time to throw one salvo of their javelin. They fall back hastily, just in time to avoid the asymmetrical collision with Carthaginian cavalry. The two cavalries clash in an incredibly messy melee, where iron, horse, and men are impossible to tell apart. This is not the standard for cavalry as warfare goes. Cavalry are meant to be mobile, not engaged in frontline clashes. This seemingly disorganized standstill was yet another ploy from the African general, who then gave the signal to his Numidian cavalry the best horsemen in Africa, to perform the pre-planned blitz flanking on each edge of the battle line. Both wings flanked the battle line and swiftly engaged the enemy from the rear. The Velites, who had retreated behind the Roman cavalry, were getting ready to join and assist the Roman cavalry, who had now halted the onslaught of the Carthaginian cavalry. But to their horror, they are now engaged by the Numidians before they could even muster a cohesive defense. On foot and completely caught off guard, the Roman Velites have no option but to flee. What ensues is a sheer massacre of the remaining Roman forces, who are now pinned between the Iberian cavalry in the front and the experienced Numidians in the back. In the melee, Scipio is injured and falls from his horse. His son, reacting quickly, gathered a few of his men to retrieve him. They manage to escape the battlefield and make to the Roman camp. But the rest of his army is not so lucky. The Roman forces are completely routed. This victory abruptly shifts the psychological makeup of this war. The Roman Senate is now in a full-blown panic with this enemy who had crossed the Alps and that had completely destroyed a full Roman army. It is not long before Gallic chiefs throw their support behind Hannibal, and Italian defectors come to the African support, enabling him to replenish his supply. And back home in Carthage, Hannibal's name is for the first time spoken to in comparison to that of his father. Battle of Trebia, December 218 BC. The manner with which Hannibal had defeated Scipio's army caused Gallic tribes to flock to the African to pledge their support in the war effort, further damaging Rome's prestige. Scipio falls back to Placentia, but he is soon faced with a Gallic rebellion within his own camp. The Gauls kill many Roman soldiers in their sleep and bring the heads of many Romans to Hannibal as proof of their defection and commitment to join his cause. Further weakened and himself wounded from the battle in Ticinus, Scipio takes camp in the mountains where he can better defend his position and awaits the second consulate army that Rome had dispatched to his aid. It is not long before Tiberius Sempronius Longus arrives with his troops and joins forces with Scipio. Tiberius Longus was renowned to have a temper and to be impatient, and so he completely rejects the calls from Scipio to exercise prudence against Hannibal and to wait until further Roman troops are gathered and trained. Tiberius Longus, who years prior had scored a victory against Carthage in the Iberian Peninsula, was sure of his capacity to defeat Hannibal. He had an army superior in numbers. He also had 2 trained Roman legions. Tiberius Longus sets up his camp facing Hannibal across the Trebia River, confident that he has the higher ground and the more defensible position. Soon enough, troops from both armies engage into skirmishes that draw more and more troops into the battle. Hannibal is made aware of the situation and quickly withdraws his troops to his camp, not wanting to engage into a battle without a plan. The Romans follow suit and welcome the break in order to rest their men. Night falls. All seem quiet at the Roman camp until the troops are awakened when the alarm is raised. The Africans are attacking. The troops barely have time to put their gear on, and no time to eat, when they are met with a deluge of projectiles. Tiberius Longus did not need another invitation. He orders his full army to engage the Carthaginians at once. He sends his full cavalry, 4,000 horses assisted by 6,000 velites. The Numidians immediately retreat, occasionally making quick hit-and-run raids. Tiberius Longus orders the rest of his army to march forward and support the cavalry, in close pursuit of the Carthaginians. The Numidian cavalry, still engaged by the Roman cavalry, is forced to cross the river. Even so, they continue to harass the Romans as they retreat. On the west bank of the Trebia across the plain, Hannibal had amassed his now well-rested troops, who had also had enough time to feed and dress appropriately for this most frigid December morning. Tiberius, still in pursuit of the Numidian cavalry, crosses the Trebia River with his whole army, a process that takes hours. Finally, the crossing is complete, and the Roman general adopts a traditional posture with his velites in the front, his infantry right behind, flanked on both sides by an equal-sized cavalry. Then he marches forward. Hannibal holds his position and lets the enemy come to him. Here, it is important to realize how cunning this move from Hannibal was. Already the Roman troops were awake and out of schedule, drawn out in the cold without time to put on all their winter layer. Most had marched on foot in pursuit of the nimble and swift Numidian cavalry. Not only that, but they also had just crossed the frigid river only to find themselves wet and shivering minutes before the battle. Oh, and they hadn't had food yet. And now they had to march towards the enemy because their general felt confident and was eager to see battle. Adrenaline can only carry a man so far. Hannibal, on the other hand, makes sure to mirror, best he can, Tiberius's formation. It is now noon, and the front-line skirmishers engage, but the Roman velites are already tired. Worst of all, they have depleted their projectile against the Carthaginian cavalry runs. They are quickly overpowered and fall back behind the advancing Roman infantry lines. Far superior in number and heavier armed, the Roman infantry meets with the Gallic forces and immediately start to push them back. Meanwhile, on the flanks, the two cavalries are brought to what looks like a standstill. Although especially trained Roman velites deal a heavy blow to Hannibal's elephant troops, the experience and discipline of the now rested Numidians comes through, and both Roman cavalries buckle almost simultaneously. At that same moment, Hannibal orders 2,000 hand-picked elite troops, who were hidden in a dry riverbed, to join the Numidians and complete what now reveals itself as an encirclement. Now elephants, horses, and elite troops are engaging the Roman infantry from their unshielded rear. The great majority of the usually well-organized Roman infantry falls prey to chaos. Many footed Roman troops die on the wings of the kilometer-long battle line as they are compressed from both infantry troops in the front and cavalry in the back. The Roman wings quickly buckle, but the central veteran infantry lines are able to breach the Carthaginian thin lines, but they are now surrounded, quickly outnumbered, and without support of any cavalry. With experience on their side, and unlike the other legions, the experienced Roman central infantry manages to maintain their cohesive formation and retreat from the battlefield. 28,000 Roman troops were lost that day, a heavy toll compared to the 4,000 Carthaginian losses. Hannibal has scored yet again another complete victory against a Roman army, far superior in number and with troops better equipped than his own. A true tactical masterpiece that does not go unnoticed. If the Roman were worried before about the African general, they are now in a full-blown panic, as both consuls, back-to-back, had lost in spectacular fashion against Hannibal, and the Gallic tribes who were providing superficial support to the Carthaginians before were now ready and willing to die for his cause. Rome now realizes it needs to fight fire with fire. It needs a general that thinks like Hannibal. With the election of two new consuls, the Roman Senate now hoped to block Hannibal's entry into Italy, with two new generals that had a long track record of victories on the field, and even better, victories against the Carthaginians, and Titus Quintius Flaminius was their man. Elected consul twice, Flaminius was known for his fiery temper and lack of patience, even against orders from Rome. So impatient he was that immediately after being elected consul, he took command of his army and marched to meet Hannibal in battle, without having performed the proper religious ceremonies. An omen of things to come. Flamininus is sent north. Servilius Gerenimus is sent northeast. The Senate was now sure that Hannibal would not find a way into Italy. Flaminius, a darling of the people, was the general that had freed Rome a few years prior from the Gallic invasion. So he was very experienced. In addition, he bolstered his ranks with the 10,000 legionnaires that had escaped the Battle of Trebia a few months before. With an experienced army, an experienced general, and a well-defended fort, Flamininus was ready for Hannibal, and to his mind, no trickery nor tactic would save Hannibal now. Hannibal was now well aware that the two consulate armies were blocking his two possible routes to Rome in well-defended positions. Engaging either of them would require a long series of sieges and skirmishes that would give enough time for the two armies to join up against him, and this could not be allowed. So Hannibal, a true student of the art of war, does what his enemy has not thought of. He crosses the treacherous Apennine Mountains and the spring marshlands to the south of the mountain ranges, an excruciating march that would be led by the veteran forces up front and the newer Gallic recruits in second. He makes sure that the end of his column is surveilled by his Numidian troops to deter any ideas of defectors from the Gallic tribes. It takes them 4 days of dread. The march is so taxing that they lose many of their horses and all their remaining elephants but one. But what they have gained, though, is the element of surprise, because both Roman generals are unaware that Hannibal is in fact in Italy, with 35,000 men. But this maneuver has also enabled Hannibal to now position his armies between the Roman armies and Rome, essentially cutting of their supplies. The Roman generals had to respond. The crossing of the Apennine mountain ranges also come at an important personal cost to Hannibal. It is during this march that he suffers an eye infection that he has no time to treat. He eventually goes blind from one eye. Depleted from the march, the African general needs provisions, fast, but he also needs to know where the Roman generals are. His scouting parties quickly return and inform him that Flaminius is a few days' march southeast of his position in a well-defended fort. We are told by historians that Hannibal often did his own scouting disguised as a local. This would also explain his superb understanding of the battlefield, which he often took advantage of. Many of those details of the terrain he employed could not have been relayed by scouts. The Carthaginians plundered the surrounding countryside and set ablaze everything they could get their hands on. And then Hannibal marched his troops all along the valley, right next to Flamininus's encampment. Another ruse designed to get the Roman general out of the security of his fort and engage him in battle in the open field. Flaminius's advisors and the legionnaires from the battle at Trebia are able to convince the general not to fall for the lure set by Hannibal and to wait for the second consul army, who should be arriving in a few days. The African general knows that Flaminius is given to impulsive decisions and increases the taunting by marching his army past Flaminius's camp and heading south towards Rome. This was something that the Roman could not allow. Allowing Hannibal to burn the northern Italian countryside is one thing, but letting Hannibal march towards Rome while his men are encamped in the security of the fort in Arretium is madness. In no way would a two-time consul allow his name to be tarnished with the title of the one who let Hannibal reach Rome. With his 20,000 men all battle-hardened on well-known terrain, well-fed and well-rested, the Roman is assured of victory. He sets out in pursuit of Hannibal and put an end to the burning and scorching that Hannibal has left in his wake, a reminder of his hesitation to engage the African earlier on. As he reaches the edge of the lake Trasimene, Flaminius and his men spot Carthaginian campfires at the other end of the lake. He seizes the opportunity and tells his men to march on to the Carthaginian camp, quickly. The 7-kilometer-long Roman column advanced through the lake's morning mist. Soon the veteran legionaries are cut off as they run into Hannibal's infantry, who seem to appear out of nowhere in the thick mist. The two armies engage. The rest of the Roman column makes their way along the lakeshore to join the ongoing battle. But in the hills above, the African general had hidden the brunt of his troops. He has waited long enough for the Roman column to be committed on the lakeshore path. He orders a second division to cut off the exit from the rear of the advancing Romans. Then he gives the order for the troops in the hillside to rush down. The Gauls did not need convincing. They had seen Flaminius massacre and pillage their land for years, and their hatred for the Roman general could not be greater. The avalanche of 20,000 men rolls down towards the now pinned Roman army. Total confusion envelops the Roman troops, as the enemy appears out of nowhere and they have no space to organize, being compressed one side by the Carthaginians and on the other by the water. There is no time for battle formations, no time for organized division and audible trumpet calls. In a frantic panic, many Romans tried to stand their ground and face the horde of Africans who were cutting mercilessly through their ill-prepared lines. Those who tried to flee drowned in the lake, heavied by their armor. Once the mist lifted, the sheer scale of this Roman defeat was revealed. We are told by Roman historians that 16,000 Romans lost their lives that day. Flaminius had also perished during the battle. Hannibal ordered his men to find his body so he could give him a proper burial, but alas. This victory against such a sizable Roman division, led by the most experienced of Roman generals, sent chills throughout the Roman Empire. This has to be one of the largest ambushes in military history, and it speaks to the genius of Hannibal and his godlike ability to control such a large army. Concealing a few dozen men is easily done. Concealing 35,000 men is unthinkable. The terrain on the hillside of the lake is difficult to operate on, let alone at night. And he managed to synchronize the events from the battle with his armies, separated in 3 groups on opposite ends of the lakeshore. This battle is yet another display of the tactical brilliance of the Carthaginian. It wasn't just the number of men lost that further horrified Rome, it was also the manner in which it had been done. The Roman population grew restless and scared. The Senate decided that something drastic had to be done. Italian defections also increased to align with Hannibal. Rome and its political elite was now desperate for a victory, and they were running low on men. Meanwhile, Hannibal had a clear path to Italy, and soon to Rome itself. In order to meet the challenge of an unorthodox African general, the Roman Senate elected Quintus Fabius Maximus as consul. And Quintus was one to not shy away from any tactic, no matter how shocking, to achieve victory. Finally, Rome seemed to understand that traditional warfare would not work against such a cunning enemy. According to Roman sources, Quintus possessed a mild temper and slowness in speaking. As a child, he had difficulties in learning, engaged in sports with other children cautiously, and appeared submissive in his interactions with others. Little did they know that these qualities hid the temperament of a shrewd military strategist. Wasting no time to address the Hannibal challenge, Quintus set ablaze the whole Italian countryside in an effort to destroy crops, the food banks of the Carthaginians in this alien land. The desired intent was to starve Hannibal and his troops. As bold and desperate as strategies go, this one was bold. The strategy worked, however it came at a heavy price. The whole Roman economy was put on pause as agriculture and its derivative activities were suddenly suspended. This started to put enormous pressure on the Roman political elite, who grew restless, many of them owners of lands being scorched by Fabius. Only a few months in, they cave and elect new consuls, who return to more traditional means of conflict operations. Large army, very large army, plus Roman experience should equal assured victory. It had worked in the past, it should work now, especially that Hannibal was now weakened. Consul Varro and Consul Paulus are elected. Their armies are raised, and they make march towards Cannae. Summer 216 BC, Hannibal and his troops were getting desperate for food. Learning of a lightly fortified Roman food depot, Hannibal brings his troops to Cannae, and quickly seizes the depot with his 50,000 men. The newly elected consuls see their opportunity to deal with Hannibal once and for all. The land is flat, the enemy is pinned, and hungry. In the Romans' eyes, there is no better chance to deal a fatal blow to the Africans. It is one thing to lead an army. It is something else completely to have grown up a soldier and experienced war as a young man. This is where Hamilcar Barca had given his son an outsized advantage compared to all other commanders, even the ones trained by Rome. In fact, the 3rd century BC Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu describes Hannibal's approach the best in this phrase: victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. It is with this mindset that the Carthage leader prepared for his next challenge. The combined consulate armies, now strong of 86,000 blades marching towards Cannae. So short was Rome on men to fight, that many senators had to answer the call to arms and fulfill their military duty. Both consuls, as was the tradition, alternated command of the combined troops each day. Hannibal engaged in a long series of taunts to draw the men to fight him, all the while scoring psychological victories by raiding the lightly defended alternate Roman camp and posting his troops for hours in front of the Roman garrison who refused to fight. This was also one way for Hannibal to test which one of the consuls was more susceptible to his mind games. Varro, the more eager general, the first one to crack and order his men to the field to deal with Hannibal once and for all. The Roman consuls were each on both wings, with their equally split cavalry. A poor position to coordinate such a large army. Hannibal, however, was in the front line giving orders to his troops, and from his vantage point he had a good view of the battlefield. This enabled him to react quickly to the changing landscape of the battle, but more importantly, his presence boosted the morale of his troops. This would become crucial as the battle unfolded. Light infantry line, preceded by slinged troops, faced the much larger Roman infantry lines. On the right flanks, the Numidian cavalry was set to face an equally sized Roman cavalry. On the left flank, the well-equipped Carthaginian cavalry outnumbered the Romans 3-1. They wasted no time and attacked with full force the Roman cavalry, an attack led by Hasdrubal himself, the brother to Hannibal. The African cavalry quickly subdued their Roman counterpart on the left flank, causing them to flee. Paulus narrowly escapes and rejoins the center column to assist the core of the battle. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, as was the tradition, the Carthaginian cavalry crossed the battlefield to double up on the stalemated right flank. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian infantry was slowly and calculatingly falling its center lines back, giving the Romans the impression that their advance was bearing fruit. All this was being coordinated by Hannibal, who was himself in the front lines, making sure that the lines did not break. Back on the right flank, the remaining Roman cavalry, led by Varro, decided to flee the battle, being no match for the combined Carthaginian cavalries. By then, the Africans' slow retreat had transformed from a seemingly weak convex line into a concave encirclement of the Roman foot soldiers. And the once orderly Roman columns had turned into a disorganized mob, driven by confidence that victory was near and further reassured by the signs that the enemy seemed to be retreating. Soon, as the Carthaginian front line slowly gave ground, the Roman infantry found themselves in between two hidden columns of experienced Numidians that Hannibal Barca had hidden on a flat battleground. To add to the Romans' trouble, the Africans' cavalry, free of their duty, now completed the encirclement for a devastating effect. Suddenly finding themselves having to fight the enemy from almost all directions, the Romans' traditionally orderly ranks collapsed into a completely disorganized mess. There was no space for movement. To make matters worse, the Gallic forces now looked like Roman forces, as they had equipped themselves with the armors and blades of fallen legionaries from battles past. This also gave the Carthaginian front line increased resistance and the ability to only lightly engage the Roman front line for a prolonged period of time, until such time that the trap was set. The trumpet calls that usually helped organize the Roman troops were now working against them, as no one could recognize the calls from their own platoons. What ensued was a complete massacre of the remaining Roman forces. In the melee, the co-consul Paulus was killed, and not just him, but 80 senators and countless high-ranking officials were also killed. A magistral blow to Rome. 56,000 Roman troops did not leave the battlefield that day. Both consuls were killed. An additional 16,000 were taken prisoners. In contrast, Hannibal had lost only 5,000 men. This battle, the Battle of Cannae, is studied to this day by military strategists all over the world. It is a true tactical masterpiece. A trap surely set the moment the African general decided to take this particular food depot, resulting in the lure of the Roman army to a familiar open-ground battle, which he also used to his advantage. In fact, for those who love science fiction, they will recognize this tactic in the book Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. After the greatest blow to any army in history, Hannibal had an unopposed path to Rome. His generals pleaded with him to hurry and march to Rome, now defenseless. Hannibal refused, under the guise that his soldiers needed time to recoup. Historians have speculated on the reasons why Hannibal didn't push for Rome right away, but alas, we will never know. Back home, as Hannibal was on the verge of changing the trajectory of history, one of his trusted generals, General Hanno, had ambitions of his own. Hanno would delay much-needed support that Hannibal needed to complete the assault on Rome, and this lasted for months. The two historians, Appian and Livy, report a conversation between Hannibal and Scipio Africanus. Scipio asked, "Who in Hannibal's opinion is the best general in history?" Hannibal's first pick was Alexander the Great. The second was King Pyrrhus of Epirus, and for the third, the African general chose himself. Scipio could not hide his dismay that Hannibal had overlooked him who had overcome Hannibal in the Battle of Zama. So he asked Hannibal, "Where would you place yourself if you had not been defeated by me?" Without missing a beat, Hannibal replied, "In that case, I should have put myself before Alexander." Many have speculated on the nature of why Hannibal did not attack and sack Rome when he had the chance. Some have postulated that his army was spent and indeed needed rest. Others have forwarded the notion that Hannibal did not feel comfortable taking on such a well-defended city. All the reasons above fall short on the comparative fact. Hannibal had an army that was able to cross the Alps, an army capable of defeating a better trained and better equipped army, even at a 2-to-1 odds. Hannibal certainly understood the psychology of the victory of Cannae, and that marching towards Rome itself, a lightly defended Rome, who had lost consecutive battles against the now godlike African general, would instill terror. A force stronger than cavalry against a spearless infantry, fear itself. No, Hannibal did not attack Rome, because like his idol Alexander the Great, he was not a monster. And it was what he was not willing to do that his nemesis Scipio did to win the war. When Scipio attacked Carthage, in hopes that it would cause Hannibal to return home, the plan worked, shifting the theater of operation from the Italian peninsula to the North African coast. It is truly there, that the balance of civilization power set on the African and rose on the European continent. An unbroken line from the Natufians and the inventors of the Ashango bone front the Congo basin. To the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex and its many derivatives, including Sumer and the Phoenicians, to the Kushite, the Ethiopians, and the Carthaginians. This defeat, coupled with the accelerating climate change disaster that was now unfolding at full speed in the Sahara, caused mass famine and decline of civilizations all over Africa. A true population setback that would take millennia and introduction of new high-yield crops to address. It is at this symbolic moment that Africa's fortune changed, leaving behind it only echoes of its deeds, from religion to philosophy and mathematics, knowledge that it had ushered and shared to the then-known world, a fact that is now lost to most and for which we have to fight. You can support us by joining the channel benefactors either on YouTube or on Patreon. Moreover, you can help by sharing this video to your friends and loved ones. If you want us to make a part 2 to this documentary, please let us know in the comment. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.